Up, up, and away, the magic of hot air balloons. Did you know that the first hot air balloon flight carried a duck, a rooster, and a sheep? It's true. Back in 1783, the Montgolfier brothers in France sent these animal passengers up in the air. Why? They wanted to see if it was safe for humans to fly. Hot air balloons are like giant, colorful bubbles floating in the sky. They're not just pretty to look at, they're also amazing examples of science in action. When you see a hot air balloon drifting peacefully overhead, you're watching a real-life science experiment. It's all about hot air, gravity, and the incredible power of buoyancy. By the end, you'll be an expert on the science of these gentle giants of the sky. So buckle up, or should I say climb into the basket? We're about to take off on a scientific adventure. Let's start with a word that might sound fancy, but is actually pretty simple. Buoyancy. Buoyancy is what makes things float. You've seen it in action if you've ever pushed a beach ball underwater in a pool. The ball wants to pop back up to the surface, right? That's buoyancy at work. In the case of hot air balloons, buoyancy is all about the difference between the air inside the balloon and the air outside. If the air inside the balloon is lighter or less dense than the air outside, the balloon will rise. When we heat up the air inside the balloon, it becomes less dense. The hot air inside the balloon is like a bunch of tiny, energetic dancers bouncing around. And voila, that's how we get our balloon to float up into the sky. Now let's dive a little deeper into why hot air rises. Have you ever heard the phrase heat rises? Well, it's not exactly the heat that's rising, it's the hot air. It all comes down to density, which is just a fancy way of saying how much stuff is packed into a certain space. When air gets hot, the molecules in it start to move around more. They bounce off each other and spread out. This means that in the same amount of space, there are fewer air molecules when the air is hot than when it's cold. Fewer molecules mean less weight, and that's why hot air floats up through cooler air. In a hot air balloon, we use a big burner to heat up the air inside the balloon. As this air gets hot and rises, it fills up the balloon and lifts it off the ground. The hotter the air inside the balloon, the higher it can go. So, what exactly are we putting inside these giant balloons? Well, it's not helium like in those small balloons you get at parties. Hot air balloons are filled with, you guessed it, hot air, but it's not just any air. It's air that's been heated up to make it less dense than the surrounding atmosphere. A typical hot air balloon can hold about 65,000 cubic feet of air. The burner in a hot air balloon can heat the air to temperatures around 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. Now, you might be wondering why we don't use helium or hydrogen, which are naturally lighter than air. Helium is expensive and in short supply. Hydrogen, while very light, is also very flammable. Not something you want in a balloon with an open flame. The cool thing about using heated air is that it's easy to control. Section 5, going up. The ascent of a hot air balloon. Alright, let's talk about takeoff. Getting a hot air balloon off the ground is a bit like launching a very slow, very gentle rocket. First, the balloon is laid out on the ground and partially inflated with cold air using big fans. Once the balloon is partially inflated, it's time to fire up the burners. These burners are super powerful. They can produce over 30 million BTUs of heat per hour. As the burners blast hot air into the balloon, it starts to inflate fully and stand upright. The pilot keeps heating the air until the balloon is fully inflated and starts to lift off the ground. It's not a sudden takeoff like in an airplane. It's more like slowly floating up, almost as if by magic. The ideal temperature inside the balloon is usually around 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. The pilot uses short bursts from the burner to maintain this temperature and control the ascent. Section 6, coming down the gentle descent. What goes up must come down, right? But how do we bring a hot air balloon back to Earth? Unlike a plane or a helicopter, a hot air balloon doesn't have an engine to power it down. Instead, the descent is all about cooling things off. To start coming down, the pilot simply stops using the burner. As the air inside the balloon cools, it becomes denser. This makes the balloon heavier relative to the outside air and it starts to sink. But wait, we don't want our balloon to come crashing down. That's why pilots use a special valve at the top of the balloon. This valve can be opened to let out some of the hot air, allowing for a more controlled descent. Landing a hot air balloon takes skill and practice. When the balloon is close to the ground, the pilot will fully open the top valve to release a lot of hot air. Section 7. Time in the sky. How long can balloons fly? Now you might be wondering, once a hot air balloon is up in the air, how long can it stay there? Well, the answer depends on a few things, but typically, a hot air balloon flight lasts between 1 to 3 hours. The main factor that determines flight time is fuel. Hot air balloons carry propane tanks to fuel their burners. A typical balloon might carry enough propane for about 3 hours of flight, but pilots usually plan for shorter flights to be on the safe side. Weather also plays a big role in how long a balloon can stay up. For your typical sightseeing hot air balloon ride, you can expect to be in the air for about an hour or two. Section 8. Balloons in the real world. More than just fun. Hot air balloons aren't just for fun rides and pretty pictures. In meteorology, scientists sometimes use hot air balloons to gather data about the atmosphere. These balloons can carry instruments high into the sky to measure things like temperature, humidity, and wind speed at different altitudes. Hot air balloons have also been used in search and rescue operations. Their ability to float slowly and quietly over an area makes them great for spotting people or vehicles that might be lost in remote areas. In some parts of the world, hot air balloons are being explored as a way to provide internet access to remote areas. So, the next time you see a hot air balloon drifting peacefully across the sky, remember, it's not just a beautiful sight.